Hey there, welcome back to Pepper Geek. In today's video, I'll be talking about growing peppers in containers versus in the ground. So if you've been watching our channel for any amount of time, you know that we grow in containers and in the ground, so we have experience in both realms and we have our opinions about each. There are definitely positives and negatives to each, so today we're going to break those down and go through it with you. So let's start with container gardening. We've done a lot of gardening in containers. In fact, that's how we got our start here on Pepper Geek. We started growing peppers in pots and we have not looked back. And I think this is the case for a lot of new gardeners. It's just so accessible to pick up a container, some potting soil, a few seeds, and you're ready to get started. So what are some of the benefits of growing in containers? Well, for one, it's extremely flexible. There are so many different varieties of containers. You can buy sort of small decorative pots like these, or you can use really cheap nursery style pots like this. This is another decorative pot that we have nothing planted in right now. We also became a big fan of these recently, which are grow bags. They come in so many different sizes. These are about 7 gallon. As you can see when you open it up, it's pretty large inside. We got some really big plants off of these, and we're planning on experimenting with even bigger bags just to see how big of a plant we can grow. But behind me you can see some other container options. These are just plastic pots. They're really cheap and they come in a variety of colors and sizes. And in that flexibility comes a lot of control. For example, this 1 gallon pot has a cayenne pepper in it, and you can see it's much larger than these smaller plants beside it here that are in maybe a pint size or even smaller containers. So we've talked about this a million times before, but growing in a smaller container leads to a smaller plant and a smaller harvest, but also much more manageable sized plants if you have a smaller growing space. Maybe you don't have a yard and your only option is to grow in containers. Well, you're in luck because it's really fun and easy to do so. Another benefit of container gardening is that the plants are mobile, meaning you can move them around when you need to. This can come in handy when you run into some unexpected cold weather. If 2 weeks after you've moved your plants outside, you're expecting a random frost, you can just bring your container plants indoors overnight and move them back outside when it warms back up. And depending on your yard, you might not be able to plant your in-ground bed on the sunniest part of your property. So with containers, you can just put them into the sunniest spot and get the ideal location for those plants. Another benefit is that you can grow indoors. You're not going to be growing your in-ground plants indoors. That just doesn't make any sense. So obviously, if you plan to do any indoor gardening under grow lights, like you see behind me, you're going to have to get used to growing in containers and using potting soil. Just a couple other great benefits. Potted plants have naturally good drainage. Most pots will come with pre-drilled holes in the bottom, and if they don't, you can always drill them yourself, like in a 5-gallon bucket or maybe a ceramic pot that doesn't have a hole. You can just add one yourself and the plants will have great drainage. And another benefit is the lack of weeding that you'll have to do with your container plants. The amount of surface soil for each container plant is relatively small compared to an in-ground bed. So even if you do have a random weed pop up in one of your container plants, it's very easy to notice it and just pluck it right out. So with all of those positives, let's talk about some of the negatives when it comes to growing in containers. And number one is that you're going to have to water more frequently than with your in-ground plants. Most bagged potting soils are made up of either coco coir or sphagnum peat moss. Those are really highly aerated materials, but they're also lightweight and they tend to dry out a lot faster. So in the dead of summer when it's very hot, your pepper plants are going to be drinking a lot of water. And on those really hot days, you might be watering once or even twice a day, even on your biggest plants. With your in-ground plants, the water retention in that ground soil is a lot better. So you might be able to get through a week of really hot, dry weather without watering once. So this is especially important if you ever plan on going away during the hotter months of the year. You're going to need to ask someone to water your potted plants because otherwise you'll come back and those plants will be dead. Of course, there are some alternative options if you want to set up some sort of automated irrigation system with your hose. There are hose timers that will automatically water every so often, turning on and off the water as needed. Another drawback of potted plants is that they can easily be knocked over by strong winds if you don't support the base of your pots. This happens less often with heavy containers like clay pots, but if you're using plastic containers, you're going to see them knock over every once in a while. We've used bricks or rocks just around the sides of our containers to prevent this from happening, but even then, in a really strong wind, especially later in the season when the plants are at their tallest and they're most top heavy, you will have to pick up your plants once in a while, and this can lead to some damage on the plants. Another potential drawback of growing in containers is that they require fertilizer. Although many bagged potting soils are organic, they use peat moss, which is a naturally occurring plant. it's really nothing like your in-ground soil, and so you sort of have to treat it differently. Many of the soils will also come pre-mixed with slow-release fertilizer, and so they claim to feed your plants for 3 or up to 6 months I've seen. But there's a lot of guesswork that goes into how long those nutrients are actually going to feed your plants, so it's almost better to just mix in your own fertilizer and add fertilizer as needed throughout the season. So with all of those negatives in mind, I still think that container gardening is a really great way to get started growing peppers. We will always have some container plants just for aesthetics or for one of the other benefits that I mentioned before. It's a really great way to grow peppers, and peppers like to be grown in containers. So now let's move on to in-ground plants. What are the benefits of growing in the ground versus containers? The first benefit is that it's a lot cheaper to get started growing in the ground versus containers. All you really have to do is kill off a portion of the grass that's in your yard, edge around it, and get started gardening. If you have really healthy soil, this may be all you need to do. If you don't, you might have to add some compost and work that soil a little bit until it is healthy enough to grow your plants, but it's still a lot cheaper to get started growing in ground versus buying a bunch of containers and fertilizer like you would need to grow in containers. Another benefit is there's less watering. We already sort of discussed this, but in-ground soil retains water a lot better than potted plants. You'll have to water less, and that's a really big time saver. And the other great benefit is that you can curate living soil in your in-ground beds. You've probably heard these terms: beneficial bacteria, living soil, microbiome. These all refer to those living organisms in the soil that benefit your plants. To get started with this, all you really have to do is start adding compost to your in-ground beds every year, either at the end of the year in fall or early spring, and work it into the first few inches of your soil. This can do so much more for the soil than just add living organisms. It can also improve drainage, or it can help retain nutrients if you have really fast draining soil. But adding homemade compost is one of the cheapest, most effective ways to improve your soil. So now moving on to some of the drawbacks of in-ground growing, and why not start with drainage issues. You can easily perform a drainage test in your yard. You just want to dig down about a foot deep and fill that hole with water and see how long it takes to drain. If you have really heavy soil that doesn't drain well, you're going to have to improve it somehow. But if you have soil that drains really fast, you have sandy soil, that's not going to hold on to the nutrients. You're going to be watering more, and your plants aren't going to grow as well. So you have to worry about these things, but it's really only a one-time issue. Same goes for pH. You're probably going to want to do a soil test and test your soil for pH, see where it's at, see if your plants are going to be happy, or if you might need to amend the soil to adjust pH. But again, more often than not, the solution is add good quality compost to that soil once a year, and over time you're going to develop really healthy soil. Another drawback of in-ground plants is that they are immobile. Once you put them in the ground, you really aren't going to be moving them around, at least not as easily as you would container plants. And so if you get the odd overnight frost a couple weeks after you moved your plants outside, you're going to have to worry about covering up those plants. You can use row cover or some plastic wrap or something like that, but it's a lot harder than just bringing in a container plant overnight, so you might have to worry about that. Another drawback is, of course, weeding. If you don't put down a layer of mulch, you're going to have to be weeding out in the garden. And if you have really fertile soil, weeding can be a weekly or even more frequently than once a week thing. It's not really fun, but there are some tools that make it pretty easy, like a weeding hoe. We use that a lot in our in-ground beds. Another drawback is animals. Small pests can easily get into your garden, so you might have to protect those plants, especially when they're really young and vulnerable, from mice and voles and rabbits, deer. Those animals will wreak havoc on your garden if you let them, whereas container plants are a little bit higher off the ground and you don't have to worry as much about them coming in and eating your leaves. So lastly, I just want to talk quickly about raised beds. Where do those fall? They're sort of like big containers, but they're also sort of like in-ground growing. So how do we feel about raised beds? Well, I really like raised beds. They have great drainage by design. You can fill them with the type of soil that you want to use. You can add compost to them. They're fixed in place, but you can still treat them sort of like an in-ground bed. But the drawback is that it's pretty expensive to build a raised bed, even if you're building it out of wood. You got to buy that wood. You have to kind of know what you're doing when you're putting it together. And if you're using something like wood, you will eventually have to replace those boards. So there's an ongoing cost associated with raised beds. And on top of that, you're going to have to fill it with soil. So you're going to have to likely buy some soil from somewhere, have it delivered, and put it into the raised bed to get yourself started. But on the plus side, they look fantastic, especially when they're made out of stone or something like that. You can really get creative and make it a beautiful part of your landscaping. They're also really easy to access. You can build them as high as you want, so if you have back problems or, bending down in the garden isn't something that you can do, raised beds can alleviate that problem. We want to say thank you to some of our first patrons. Matthew B, thank you for being our first patron. That means a lot to us. You really just dove right in and joined the highest tier, so thank you, Matthew, for joining our Patreon and being the first. Thank you as well to Carter H, Arlo G, Keely and Brandon, Jennifer M, Robin D, Benjamin H. Jr., Jill P., Tracy M. Jr., Josh R., Eric N., and Philip W. Thank you so much for joining our Patreon and making this a really special growing season. We can't wait to get started growing with you, and there'll be more shout outs in our upcoming videos on Pepper Geek. But for now, that's going to be it. Thanks for watching Pepper Geek, and I'll see you next time.